Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. Whispers at the Fair, the Pickpocket Empire of 1904. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, officially known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, was an intoxicating marvel. Glittering pavilions, electric lights, steam-powered rides, and the scent of roasting meats and candied almonds filled the air. Over 19 million people flowed through its gates, making it one of the largest gatherings in American history at the time. But while guests gawked at innovations like the wireless telegraph and marveled at ice cream cones and new musical instruments, another industry thrived in silence, one built on fingers, deception, and shadows. They came in quietly, never loudly. Most arrived weeks before the opening ceremony in April 1904. Others had been tracking its construction since 1902, knowing full well what a global exposition meant. Cash-heavy tourists, overworked local police, and enough chaos to mask a quiet fortune. You might think of pickpockets as lone wolves, sneaking through crowds with nimble hands and tattered coats. But what unfolded at the 1904 World's Fair was something far more structured. It was an empire. A city built for theft. St. Louis had ballooned into a temporary metropolis. Hotels overflowed, alleyways bustled with merchants and performers, and nearly 1,200 acres of exposition grounds became a stage not just for world innovation, but for organized petty crime. The police department, unprepared for such scale, scrambled to deputize volunteers. Many of them were fresh from farms or local shops, given badges but no training. These inexperienced officers often became targets themselves, stripped of watches, wallets, even revolvers, without realizing it until hours later. In the first 2 weeks alone, the St. Louis police received more than 600 complaints of theft. Newspapers downplayed the problem, often attributing stolen purses to accidental loss or misplacement due to excitement. But insiders knew better. One Chicago detective working under false credentials later testified that the fairgrounds had more professional fingers than a poker table at a police wake. Enter the kings of the wire. Wire was the period slang for pickpocket, and in the early 1900s, none were more feared or revered than the Wire Kings, a tight syndicate of criminal craftsmen based in New York and Chicago. The syndicate didn't just steal, they trained. Apprentices learned hand pressure points, blindfolded drills, and distraction techniques in backrooms of cigar shops. At the fair, these men didn't look like criminals. They dressed well, smelled of cologne, and often worked in teams of 3. The stall, a large man or couple who accidentally bumped the target. The dip, the actual thief who snatched the wallet, watch, or coin purse in seconds. The layer, the runner who took the stolen item and disappeared, often within 10 seconds of the grab. This structure made arrests almost impossible. If someone caught the dip, the goods were already gone, and the stall, just an innocent bystander. The fair's first arrest. The first major incident involved a man named Alvin "Slats" McGovern, who was nabbed while attempting to steal a silver pocket watch from a railroad executive. Slats had been a known pickpocket in Chicago for years, but had never served more than 30 days at a time. He was too fast, too careful. When detectives searched his rented room in downtown St. Louis, they found a hand-stitched coat with 32 hidden compartments and 4 fake mustaches sewn into the lining. The newspapers gave the story half a paragraph. "Petty thief caught near Machinery Hall," one line read. But what they didn't say was this: Slats had 3 aliases and had lifted nearly $7,000 worth of goods in the prior month alone, a fortune at the time. He wasn't alone. The women in the game. Perhaps most surprising to the public, though not to investigators, was the number of women involved. Pickpocketing at the 1904 fair wasn't just a man's world. Inez Beauchamp, a 26-year-old seamstress from Philadelphia, was arrested in July after lifting a velvet coin purse from an elderly socialite during the opera performance at Festival Hall. Inez wore custom gloves with slits at the palm, allowing her to maintain her grip while appearing perfectly dainty. She posed as a widow, walking arm in arm with elderly women to protect them from the crowd. In fact, she often relieved them of their jewelry before the performance even started. Detectives called her the Dainty Razor. She was released the next day with no charges filed, partly due to her charm, partly because the victim refused to press charges out of embarrassment. The Watchman's Game. There were over 400 watchmen assigned to fairground security, but fewer than 10 detectives. As theft reports piled up, a quiet rift formed. Should the crimes be pursued at all? The fair brought in millions. Word of organized theft might scare off high-profile guests. The city's mayor was reportedly warned not to tarnish the exposition with whispers of organized crime. So detectives worked quietly, using unofficial liaisons from Pinkertons and trusted officers in plain clothes. One such detective was William "Billy" Kern, a soft-spoken man who spent 2 months undercover in the fair's food court area. Posing as a sausage vendor, he compiled detailed logs of suspects' movements, their hand signals, and even sketches of their escape routes. Kern's findings, buried in a 1906 police report, long after the fair ended, suggested at least 120 professionals operated in the grounds between April and November 1904. That number, he noted dryly, does not include the amateurs. A crime you never see coming. One pickpocketing tactic was called the blind turn. It happened like this. A man would walk ahead of you in a crowd. He'd suddenly stop, look confused, and turn sharply back into your path. You'd instinctively step aside. In that moment, the dip moved past you from behind. Your pocket was lightened. You wouldn't know until much later, maybe hours. This was the art of psychological disruption, and the World's Fair was full of it. Attendees stood shoulder to shoulder for hours. Rides jerked, music blasted, drinks spilled, and colors flashed. It was sensory overload, and amid that noise, crime was quieter than a breath. Many victims didn't report the theft until they'd returned to their hotels. Some never noticed at all until it was time to pay for dinner or tip the cab driver. The missing ledger. In August, a fire broke out in a staff building behind the agricultural pavilion. Inside, investigators found a singed metal box containing what they believed was a ledger, a list of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Though water damaged, the pages showed patterns: initials, coded locations, amounts, and notes like green gloves or inlaid pocket. Historians believe this may have been the master list for the fair's pickpocket ring, but before it could be analyzed, the evidence was moved and promptly lost. Police blamed bureaucratic mix-ups. Others weren't so sure. As the fair prepared to close its gates in November 1904, the city of St. Louis had already decided to say little about its dark undercurrent. The exposition was a triumph, a celebration of American progress. But somewhere in the margins, hundreds of thieves vanished into trains, taxis, and steamboats, disappearing with hundreds of thousands of dollars in goods, and almost no trace. And yet, one name kept surfacing, scrawled in multiple arrest records, signed into a hotel under 3 different spellings, and mentioned in a single surviving Pinkerton memo. Watch for M. Crane, suspected leader. Who was M. Crane? To truly understand the inner mechanics of what many now believe was the most organized pickpocket ring in early 20th century America, we must turn to the enigma known only as M. Crane. The name first appears in a St. Louis police memo from late May 1904. Several dips confirmed to be working under a man referred to as M. Crane. Description unclear, possibly alias, monitoring required. That memo, barely 3 lines, would later become the linchpin for several retired detectives trying to track the mastermind behind what had become an invisible empire. The problem: M. Crane was never arrested, never interrogated, and for all intents and purposes may not have existed as a single person. But the signs point to someone very real. The fair's criminal infrastructure. By June 1904, theft reports had quadrupled. But what puzzled authorities wasn't just the frequency, it was the precision. Victims came from all walks of life: bankers, tourists, children, and clergy. Items were lifted from locked purses, inside coat breast pockets, and even concealed waist belts. Nothing was sacred. And then there were the patterns. Investigators noticed that thefts clustered geographically. Mondays and Tuesdays focused on the Palace of Transportation and Festival Hall. Weekends saw spikes near the Pike, the fair's entertainment district. Booth vendors frequently reported customers paying in gold coins, rare and old, some traced back to museum displays or wealthy Eastern families. The consistency pointed to a larger operation. And amid the murmurs, one figure kept surfacing in quiet conversations between criminals. Crane doesn't like heat. Or tell Crane the Pike is hot tonight. Crane, it seemed, was not just a name, he was command. The Whisper Network. Crime thrives on silence. But in the fair's sprawling underbelly of vendors, traveling performers, and backroom gamblers, whispers carried fast. A retired pickpocket named Tobias Greenlee, interviewed in the 1930s for a criminal history project, spoke plainly. You didn't speak Crane's name unless you were in the ring, not in public. He had eyes everywhere. Tobias described a network of spotters who wore red carnations pinned to their vests. At first glance, they looked like groomsmen or fair decorators. In reality, they signaled locations of high-value targets: tourists who flashed coin purses, elderly women with velvet reticules, or businessmen holding bulging money clips. Each time a target was identified, the spotter would adjust the flower, tilting it left or right depending on the direction of movement. This, Greenlee said, was Crane's language. But who spoke it? An unlikely source. Enter Martha Leland, a housekeeper working at the Pavilion Hotel in downtown St. Louis. Quiet and unassuming, Martha cleaned over 30 rooms per day, many rented by fair visitors and traveling performers. But she began to notice something odd. There were always gloves, pairs of gloves drying by the heater but never worn in the morning. She later realized the gloves were used only during nighttime excursions. In one room, she found a small vial of lamb fat used by dips to lubricate their fingers for easier movement between fabric layers. But what truly caught her eye was a paper tucked under the bed, a typed note reading, "Wednesday, meet Crane by Ferris, 9 p.m., red gloves." Martha, unsure what she'd found, handed the note to a part-time detective named Jesse Toller. Toller kept it, but no arrests were made. The man renting the room checked out the next morning, tipping her generously. Crane's profile emerges. Based on interviews, hotel logs, and scattered records, authorities compiled a loose profile. Alias Ease: M. Crane, Marcus Crane, Crane of Pike, Mr. C. Possible age: 40s. Race: likely white, Eastern accent noted. Dress: often wore pinstripe suits, spats, and wide-brimmed hats. Known associations: 2 women, possibly romantic partners, at least 4 apprentices, known pickpockets. Notable trait: never carried money, paid in watches or gold. He had no known criminal record, never appeared on Pinkerton's lists, yet multiple confirmed dips when arrested gave Crane as a contact name or employer. Some even claimed to work for him rather than with him. The idea of a pickpocketing employer was nearly unheard of in 1904. Crane's apprenticeship scheme. Documents from a 1906 Pinkerton internal review rediscovered in a Chicago archive in 1992, describe Crane's rumored training model. He reportedly ran his pickpocketing like a business. New recruits were observed for discretion and agility, trained in 4 techniques: palm shift, blind dip, coat twist, and purse knot slice. Paid weekly based on success, with bonuses for untraceable goods, watches with removed serial numbers, for example. He also enforced a strict no children rule, forbidding theft from families or minors. According to Greenlee, if you stole from a kid, you were out, no matter how good you were. This strange code gave Crane a kind of Robin Hood mystique, but the truth was simpler. Children raised alarms, and Crane didn't like alarms. The near capture. One of the closest brushes with Crane came during a nighttime incident near the Ferris wheel in September 1904. 2 undercover agents spotted a group of 3 men tailing a portly banker. The men split up, and when the banker stopped to light a cigar, the dip moved in. But something went wrong. The banker turned, felt the tug, and yelled. A brief chase ensued. The dip was caught, identified later as Arnold Finley, a miner operator from Kansas City. He carried no stolen goods, but he said this during interrogation. "I warned him, told Crane not to pull at Ferris, too many lights." The detectives perked up. They asked to describe Crane. Finley shook his head. "I never saw his face, just his gloves, always red." The final week. As the fair's final days approached, theft slowed. The Crane network, as one local reporter called it, seemed to dissolve. Vendors packed their stalls. Foreign dignitaries left quietly. Local newspapers began publishing puff pieces praising the fair, civility. But then 2 things happened. A Pinkerton agent in Memphis intercepted a wire message with the phrase, "Crane closed up, Chicago next." The message originated from a Western Union office just blocks from the fairgrounds. A pawn shop in St. Louis received a package containing 14 gold watches, no return address. Each had initials carved into the back corresponding to theft reports from June. The watches were mailed anonymously, as if someone were tying up loose ends. Crane, whoever he was, had closed shop. A fingerprint in the margin. In 1957, a box of forgotten documents was discovered in the attic of a retired detective's home. Among the brittle pages was a small, yellowed notebook simply titled Crane Fair. One page contained a list of locations. Pike 730, Machinery 910, Ferris 1000, Close by 11. Next to it, a smudged fingerprint in ink. The print was never matched to any known criminal file. But on the opposite page was a single line in careful script. Quiet hands, quiet life. Who was M. Crane? Was he a man, a myth, or a shifting identity used by many to mask a greater operation? And if he was real, where did he go? As the grand gates of the 1904 World's Fair creaked shut in the cold winds of November, the city of St. Louis exhaled. The fireworks ended. The brass bands went silent. And slowly, one by one, the men and women who had worked behind the curtains, vendors, performers, architects, thieves, disappeared into the vastness of America. The fair was over. But for a small team of detectives and Pinkerton agents, the real investigation had just begun. For them, the mystery wasn't just about pickpockets or stolen watches. It was about something bigger, a blueprint, a system, a criminal enterprise run with such precision that it might have quietly redefined what organized theft in America looked like. At the center of that quiet storm was the lingering mystery of M. Crane. The Ledger Trail. The so-called Crane Ledger, the water-damaged notebook found in the fire behind the agricultural pavilion, was the most tantalizing clue. While most pages were unreadable, a few revealed a pattern. 3-letter city codes: STL, Chi, DET, daily tallies, and strange phrases like moth line and skirt prime. Linguists and retired detectives would later interpret these as code. Moth line, targets who appeared disoriented or distracted by lights and noise. Skirt prime, wealthy female targets wearing expensive or bulky clothing, ideal for concealment. The entries spanned nearly 6 months, aligning perfectly with the fair's duration. Yet nothing in the ledger offered a full name, address, or fingerprint beyond the partial smudge. Still, this fragile document painted a clear picture. Whoever Crane was, he wasn't improvising. He was organizing. And he wasn't done. The Chicago Echoes. In 1905, police in Chicago began seeing familiar patterns: coordinated pickpocketing in amusement parks, train depots, and waterfront fairs. Again, reports mentioned 3-person teams, coded hand signals, and the ever-elusive red gloves. A young detective named Louis Barrick, recently transferred from St. Louis, flagged the activity. "They're too smooth. They're not street thugs, they're trained. I've seen this playbook before." In one instance, a known dip confessed during interrogation that he was paid by Mr. C, but the man refused to offer more. Eventually, a name surfaced again: Crane, and with it the fear in detectives' eyes. Crane had become something else, less a man and more a myth. The red gloves resurface. One of the most curious sightings came in 1906 at a charity ball in Cincinnati. A woman named Eleanor Morrow, wife of a banker, reported a theft of her diamond pendant during a crowded waltz. She hadn't felt a thing. Her husband's pocket watch was gone too. When questioned, she said this: "There was a man nearby, never touched me, but I remember his gloves. Red, unusual, elegant. I thought them charming. Now I'm not so sure." No suspect was arrested, but local police retrieved a discarded coat left near the venue. Inside the lining, a stitched label reading "Property of C." Crane, it seemed, had not vanished. He had merely evolved. A system repeated. Over the next 2 decades, detectives from New York to San Francisco began documenting patterns. High theft events like expositions, races, or political conventions. Teams of 3. No violence, no weapons. Always clean targets, didn't know until hours later. Red gloves or handkerchiefs spotted before major thefts. It was as though Crane's blueprint had been adopted like a criminal franchise. But unlike typical mob operations, there was no central body, no clear leadership structure. Just silence and red gloves. The death of Billy Kern. In 1912, former Detective William "Billy" Kern, the undercover sausage vendor from the 1904 fair, was found dead in his modest apartment in Missouri. Officially, the cause was heart failure, but among his belongings was a sealed envelope labeled "Fair, 1904, Final." Inside were notes, sketches, and a final hypothesis. Crane is not a man. Crane is a system, a method, taught, refined, protected. He compared Crane's model to a traveling circus: itinerant performers, a shared language, and a loyalty stronger than law. Kern even speculated that multiple people had taken up the name Crane or used it as cover. You can arrest a man, you can't arrest a ghost. The unspoken pact. There's a theory, one that circulated quietly among old Pinkerton agents and ex-detectives, that Crane made a deal with certain fair organizers in 1904. The logic: the fair couldn't afford scandal. Massive theft would cause panic in headlines. Better, they said, to allow controlled theft, quiet, organized, and mostly nonviolent. One letter from a Pinkerton agent to a city official dated November 1904 includes the cryptic line: "As long as they stay to silk and not skin, we look the other way." This would explain the low arrest rate despite thousands of reported thefts, and why suspects like Inez Beauchamp or Slats McGovern were often quietly released after capture. Was there a handshake agreement with a ghost? Crane's disappearance or his expansion. By the 1920s, Crane had become something of a whisper legend. Young detectives heard stories but found no case files. Only anecdotal notes, destroyed ledgers, or uncooperative witnesses. Yet theft rings continued to operate with eerie similarity, some as far as London and Paris. One 1931 report from Scotland Yard describes a trio of American tourists arrested after a string of thefts at a British industrial expo. The men were dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and carried no weapons. Each had a pair of gloves in their pocket. One pair read, "Legacy of the Silent Empire." Pickpocketing has always existed, but what happened at the 1904 World's Fair wasn't just petty crime. It was something far more modern, organized, systematic, and quietly parasitic. It fed off distraction, luxury, and overconfidence. And its most fascinating detail: you didn't know it happened until hours or decades later. Final reflection. Today, the fair is remembered for its grandeur, its progress, and its architecture. Few talk about the red gloves in the shadows, but every time you step into a crowded space, your phone loose in your coat, your wallet in your back pocket, you're living in Crane's world. He may never have existed, or he may have walked beside you last week, silent as the air, fingers ready, smile soft. And if you felt nothing, that's the point. Story 2. The Ghost of Greystone, the Disappearance of Pearl Briny. Greystone, Indiana isn't found on most maps anymore. Even at its peak in the 1910s, the town barely scraped together 2,000 residents. It was a place of dirt roads, whitewashed porches, and early winters. What it lacked in excitement, it made up for in quiet. People came to Greystone to disappear, or at least to be left alone. That was what Pearl Briny had wanted by all accounts: quiet, solitude, a second start. She arrived in the fall of 1913, a 28-year-old widow with a traveling trunk, a hard-set mouth, and a wariness about her that seemed older than her years. Locals later said she didn't smile much, but that she wasn't unfriendly. She was fine to talk to, just not much for church, as one neighbor put it. Pearl moved into a rented cottage at the edge of town, an aging clapboard house backed up against Greystone's only real hill. The home had stood empty for years, and kids had begun calling it the widow's place, long before she moved in. Then one morning, just 6 months later, Pearl Briny was gone. The vanishing. April 3, 1914. It had snowed the night before a final dusting of winter over the town's muddy tracks. At sunrise, a delivery boy named Edgar Holloway came by the Briny house with fresh milk and eggs. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The front door was open just a crack. Not wide, not flung. Just open. Inside, the hearth had gone cold. Pearl's boots were still by the door. Her coat was draped on a wall peg. A teacup sat on the table half full, but there was no sign of Pearl. The townsfolk would later say that was the most unnerving part. Nothing looked out of place. She had simply vanished. An unlikely case. Missing persons weren't exactly common in Greystone, but they weren't unheard of either. A farmhand might hop a train for work, or a drinker might wander off during a winter binge. But Pearl's case was different. She wasn't the type to run. She had no debts, no family nearby, no suitors, at least that anyone knew of. Sheriff Clarence Mears began a quiet search, nothing dramatic. Just a few questions and a few late-night visits to homes near the ridge. He walked the creek line behind her house, talked to the grocer, the blacksmith, and the landlady. By April 10th, the sheriff had filed the case away with a tired note. No evidence of foul play, possible voluntary departure, no forwarding information. But neighbors weren't satisfied. Neither was Pearl's landlady, Mrs. Agnes Keller, who swore she'd seen a man leave the house 2 nights before the disappearance. A man Pearl had never once spoken of. Tall fella, overcoat, hat too low, never saw his face, she told a reporter years later. But he didn't knock, walked right in like he'd been there before. The diary. In 1928, nearly 15 years after Pearl's disappearance, her home long abandoned was set to be demolished for a new telephone station. A demolition crew unearthed a small tin box beneath one of the floorboards in what had once been Pearl's bedroom. Inside was a diary. Most of it was mundane, notes about laundry, baking bread, comments on the weather. But one entry, dated just 3 weeks before she vanished, stood out. It's here again, the letter, same handwriting, no return address, just the one word again, soon. I burned it like the last, I won't go back. There were no other references to the letter, no indication of who sent it or what back meant, but it was enough to reopen the whispers. Pearl's past. With renewed interest, the county dug into Pearl's history. Records showed that her husband, Benjamin Briny, had died in a fire in East St. Louis in 1912. The cause was listed as accidental, a faulty stove in their boarding house. Pearl had collected a modest life insurance payout, closed the bank account, and disappeared a month later. No criminal charges had ever been filed, no further investigation, but a curious detail emerged. A neighbor's statement from the 1912 fire claimed Pearl hadn't been seen in the house for at least 2 days before the blaze. She had told police she'd gone to visit a sick aunt. No one had ever verified the claim. The letter. While no physical copy of the letter mentioned in the diary was found, a second piece of evidence emerged in the form of a library ledger. Pearl had signed out a book on poisons, medical herbalism, and toxicology, volume III, just 1 month before her disappearance. This alone might have been innocent. Women in isolated towns often read widely, and Pearl was known to be educated. But paired with the mysterious letter, the unknown man, and her previous life insurance history, investigators began to theorize. Had Pearl been running? Or had someone finally caught up with her? A trail grown cold. By 1930, Pearl Briny had become little more than a legend in Greystone. Kids dared each other to visit her overgrown house at night. Stories spread about ghosts, disappearances, and a woman who opened the wrong door. The sheriff's original files were lost in a courthouse fire in 1932. No suspect had ever been named. But those who remembered Pearl spoke with a strange mix of fear and guilt. She had wanted to be left alone, they said. She kept her curtains drawn. She walked only at dusk. She never asked for help. Some believe she never left at all. The well. In 1948, during road construction behind the original Briny property, workers unearthed an old well sealed with limestone and covered in brush. Deep, dark, and lined with rotting wood, it had likely not been used since before the turn of the century. At the bottom, nothing but mud and stones. No bones, no dress fragments, no evidence. But one thing was found wedged into the rocks. A silver locket, tarnished and cracked, containing a faded photo of Benjamin Briny and a clipped newspaper headline. Wife survives deadly rooming house blaze. A question of choice. Did Pearl run again? Was she followed by someone from her past? Or did Greystone's silence swallow her? Even today, local historians point to inconsistencies: the letter, the well, the man in the overcoat. Some claim Pearl had been hiding a second identity. Others say she was a victim of domestic revenge. One theory suggests she faked her own disappearance to escape suspicion from the 1912 fire. There are no answers, only speculation, and the memory of a woman who lived quietly, disappeared quietly, and left just enough behind to make people wonder. She was last seen wearing blue. When a person disappears without a trace, time does strange things. It distorts, it softens. Facts begin to look like rumors. Rumors harden into truth. And the more a community talks, the less it remembers what it actually saw. For Pearl Briny, the truth, or something near it, may have never surfaced. But for decades after her vanishing in 1914, pieces continued to drift up, like splinters from a long-sunken ship. The boarding house files. Following the rediscovery of Pearl's diary in 1928 and the mysterious locket in 1948, two amateur researchers, Edna Walcott and Henry Merrill, both retired schoolteachers, set about reconstructing Pearl's earlier life. They traveled to East St. Louis, where Pearl and Benjamin Briney had lived prior to the infamous rooming house fire. The building had long since been demolished, but records remained: old insurance papers, coroner reports, and an overlooked file from a private fire investigator named Virgil Minter. Minter's notes raised immediate red flags. The fire had 3 separate points of origin. Accelerants were present in the kitchen and stairwell. A gas line had been manually opened. These facts had been buried in the aftermath of the fire, dismissed during a chaotic week that saw 3 other arson investigations and a rash of robberies in the city. But Minter wrote a chilling note. Spoke with Widow Briney. Her answers were cold, precise, eyes didn't match voice. She asked me before anything if the insurance would still pay out if foul play were suspected. The insurance company inquiry. Pearl's $2,500 life insurance payout was approved within 2 weeks of the fire. Fast, even by early 20th century standards. But in 1915, a quiet review was conducted by the Prudence Mutual Assurance Co. after an internal tip flagged Benjamin Briney's policy as expedited under unclear circumstances. No charges were filed, but the internal notes were preserved. One entry reads, "Policy issued only 6 weeks before death. Physical exam waived. Beneficiary, wife Pearl, no secondary, paid in full. Immediate withdrawal of funds." Where the money went remains unknown. Bank records showed Pearl closed her account and took the funds in cash. She left the city within a week. A man with no name. Mrs. Agnes Keller, Pearl's landlady in Greystone, had described the stranger in the overcoat entering Pearl's home just before the disappearance. Initially dismissed by Sheriff Mears, the report gained new weight decades later when Merrill and Walcott tracked down an old train manifest from March 1914. A man using the name C. Henley had arrived from East St. Louis and rented a room at Hargrave's boarding house, a half-mile from Pearl's cottage. He paid 2 weeks in advance but left suddenly, on the same day Pearl was discovered missing. He left no forwarding address. C. Henley never appeared on any other travel documents, voter registries, or directories. No such person was known to authorities in either city. Was he a pursuer, a blackmailer, or worse, a co-conspirator? Unspoken histories. In 1953, Greystone's oldest resident, Mildred Pratt, agreed to an interview with a regional newspaper. When asked about Pearl, she offered a strange anecdote. Pearl used to sit on her porch in the evenings, always with a scarf over her hair and a blanket over her knees. But one night late, I saw her standing by the edge of the creek, talking to herself. Or so I thought. But there was a second shadow, tall, lean, never moved. Pratt couldn't recall the exact date, but she remembered the fear in Pearl's face. "I didn't wave, I just backed inside." The Hollow Hill. During a county survey in 1961, a team of geologists investigating erosion near the ridge behind Pearl's old cottage made a quiet discovery. Beneath the hill was an abandoned storm drain system, likely part of a long-forgotten mining attempt. The tunnels stretched for nearly a mile beneath the town, with entry points near 3 old homes, including the Briney property. In one section of tunnel, the crew found an iron lantern and a boot. The sole was marked with a manufacturer's stamp dated 1912. The tunnels were sealed shortly after for safety. No further exploration occurred. Could Pearl have used the tunnels? It's been proposed by local historians that Pearl either fled through the tunnel, escaping a pursuer, or planning her disappearance. was taken dragged or coerced into the underground and disposed of. Died accidentally, attempting to hide from someone who knew her secrets. The lantern suggests deliberate planning. The boot suggests haste. Neither answer how she knew of the tunnels unless, of course, she discovered them during her months of isolation. And if she did, the next question is simple. Why didn't she tell anyone? Pearl's voice returns. One final clue emerged in 1977. A private collector in Michigan purchased a box of vintage letters from an estate sale. Among them was a single, unsigned note written in ink on brittle yellowed stationery. No envelope, no address. It read, "You cannot imagine the relief of silence. They stop looking. You become vapor, and in vapor there is peace." The handwriting was compared to a known sample from Pearl's diary. It matched. Experts cautioned that the paper could have come from anywhere. The letter may have been fiction, practice, or written under duress. It offered no names, no dates, no locations. But if it was Pearl, she had not been gone. She had been watching. A life disassembled. What remained of Pearl Briny's story by the turn of the century was a collection of half-buried facts, guesses, and community folklore. A fire, a payout, a move, a man, a well, a tunnel, a letter. It reads like fiction, but for those who lived through it, it was real and unsettling. Because in towns like Greystone, where everyone knows everyone, Pearl's story was proof that you never really know anyone at all. As one amateur investigator phrased it in 1981, "She didn't vanish, she just stopped being seen." But why? By the time the 1980s rolled around, Greystone had faded into something close to myth. Fewer than 800 residents remained. The hill behind Pearl Briny's old cottage had become overgrown, and the house itself had collapsed during a storm in 1969, leaving only a stone chimney and foundation. Still, Pearl's story lingered. She had no surviving relatives, no children, and no estate to settle. Yet amateur sleuths, graduate students, and even a documentary film crew from Indianapolis tried to piece together her life. They never got far. Pearl had written little. She left behind no financial records after 1914, and her belongings, what little she had brought with her to Greystone, had either been sold off or lost. Except for one thing, her photograph. The photograph. A single image remained in the county archive, labeled simply as P. Briny 1913 Town Census. It's a small, washed-out print. Pearl stands stiff-backed on her porch, arms at her sides looking slightly off-camera. Her face is gaunt, but not unhappy, just reserved. The porch behind her looks warped, the paint peeling from the columns. She appears alone. But under magnification, something strange is visible. A blur in the window to her right. Just a shadow shaped like a man's shoulders, indistinct, tall. Possibly nothing. Possibly a flaw in the film. Or someone she didn't expect to be there. Cold case reopened. In 1992, driven by renewed interest in historical disappearances, Indiana State Police reopened the Briny case as a cold file. For the first time in nearly a century, forensic attention was applied. They searched the sealed storm drains beneath the hill using fiber-optic cameras. Nothing was found, no remains, no personal items. Soil testing around the Briny house turned up trace chemical residue, but not enough to suggest a crime scene. They reviewed old train manifests, hotel registries, and insurance documents. Most had been lost or redacted. Only a single, handwritten page from a coroner's inquest in East St. Louis survived containing this note. The widow insisted on quick burial, refused autopsy, claimed religious reasons. In 1912, that wasn't unusual, but in hindsight it stood out. And then there was the strange signature on the life insurance claim form. P. Briny. but under the printed name, someone had added, "For Perletta." Pearl's legal name had never been listed as anything but Pearl. Was it a clerical error, a pet name, or someone signing for her? Vanishing points. Let's pause here and consider the possible endings to Pearl Briny's story. 1. Murdered by a pursuer. A man from her past found her. Maybe someone who knew of the fire. Maybe someone who believed Pearl had more money than she admitted. She was killed quietly, her body hidden possibly in the well or the storm drains before they were sealed. But no bones were found. 2. Fled voluntarily. Fearing exposure for past crimes or for her role in Benjamin's suspicious death, Pearl orchestrated her own disappearance. The tidy state of her house supports this. The letters hint at planning. The storm drains might have offered a way out unseen. But where did she go, and why so permanently? 3. Died by accident or suicide. She may have feared for her life and died while attempting to hide. A fall in the dark, an illness untreated, but no remains or belongings ever surfaced. Still, people swear they saw her afterwards. 4. The Crane Connection Speculative Theory. One odd theory published in a 2004 regional journal attempted to link Pearl Briny to a broader network of women who faked identities during the early 20th century to evade legal trouble or domestic abuse. One name surfaced repeatedly: Crane. The theory claims Pearl may have had contact with people from the Crane Wire Network, the same group allegedly behind the pickpocketing empire, at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. The only shred of evidence: a hotel registry in Chicago from 1915 listing a P. Crane from Greystone Inn. No follow-up was ever made. The registry page was torn in half. The ghost story. Pearl Briny has become more than a cold case in Greystone. She's a local legend. A candle sometimes appears in her old foundation on April 3rd. A photo, reportedly found in the town archive in 2015, shows a woman believed to be Pearl in a crowd in Kentucky taken in 1922. Some say the wind through the trees behind her home carries a whisper, just one word: soon. A former mayor once said, "She didn't go missing, she became a mystery." Why she matters. Pearl Briny's case has no dramatic confession, no trial, no body. It is quiet and cold like the mornings in Greystone. But it's these stories unresolved, unspoken, undramatic that echo longest. They show how easily a life can slip away unnoticed, and how the line between ordinary and extraordinary crime often lies in what we choose to forget. Pearl may have run, she may have died, she may have found peace, but she never left Greystone, not really. In the end, her life became something else entirely. A question. Story 3. The Insurance Ledger: How the Ordway Scam Slipped Past Regulators. Ordway, New Hampshire, sits in a valley hemmed in by pines and Flintstone ridges, the kind of place that doesn't change much from year to year. In the early 1900s, the town barely broke 3,000 residents, but it held a peculiar distinction home to one of the smallest incorporated insurance offices in the northeastern United States. The Ordway Mutual Indemnity Company opened in 1907 in a converted post office. Its offices were clean, plain, and filled with heavy oak furniture. By appearances, it was just another cautious, conservative, rural insurance outfit. Its founder, Harold J. Winton, was a former accountant who prided himself on being a man of quiet numbers. He attended every city council meeting, donated regularly to the Lutheran Church, and was often seen walking home with his wife and their small spaniel, Muffet. By all accounts, Winton was the definition of respectable. But Ordway Mutual wasn't what it seemed. The business of nothing. In 1910, Winton filed expansion paperwork with the New Hampshire Department of Financial Institutions, claiming that his firm had issued 326 life insurance policies, 48 property coverage agreements, and 17 annuity products. The office had only one full-time employee besides Winton, a young typist named Mildred Locke, who later testified that she had never once mailed a policy to a client. Instead, she spent her days typing quarterly reports, fictional invoices, and fake correspondence sent not to policyholders, but to vacant post boxes Winton had rented in nearby towns. He built a business of nothing, complete with fabricated clients, fake premium payments, and non-existent claims. Winton even wrote condolence letters to imaginary widows, signed them himself, sometimes added small sums of good faith benefit disbursements to bolster credibility with auditors. How did it work? Winton's scam was brilliant in its simplicity. Fake policies. He created fictional policyholders using names pulled from old census records. Most were elderly, single, or deceased people unlikely to be missed. Circular audits. He wrote both sides of every transaction. He generated his own customer complaints, resolved them with grace, and filed internal memos praising staff performance. Locke said she only saw them after they were filed. Regulatory diversion. He paid all licensing fees on time, maintained perfect documentation, and quoted obscure state statutes to avoid deeper audits. He even offered discounts to other small-town insurers, creating an illusion of networked legitimacy. Investor illusion. Perhaps most cunning of all, Winton offered micro-investment opportunities in regional underwriting ventures. These were pitched in small towns via mailers and letters, encouraging rural citizens to invest $25 to $500 for a share of profits. In truth, there were no profits, no risk pools, no underwriting tables, just Harold Winton, his typewriter, and an ever-growing maze of imaginary commerce. The unraveling begins. It wasn't a bank that unraveled Ordway Mutual. It wasn't a regulator or competitor. It was a printer. In 1914, a young man named Elliot Brewer, working at the local print shop, grew suspicious after noticing that Ordway Mutual's letterhead orders had ballooned from once a month to weekly, sometimes daily. Not only that, but the address blocks were always different. Brewer brought it up casually to his father, Albert Brewer, who happened to be on the town council. Albert, intrigued, asked to see some of the mailers. A few appeared legitimate, but others referenced towns that didn't exist or had ceased to exist 40 years prior. He took the matter to Judge Leonard Strake, who quietly initiated a review. The ledger audit. Strake requested an informal audit, conducted without alerting Winton. Over the course of 2 weeks, the audit team, a professor from Dartmouth, a local accountant, and a state deputy reviewed the files stored in Ordway Mutual's safe. What they found astonished them. Policy numbers duplicated dozens of times, each with different names and issue dates. Check stubs to imaginary people, signed and recorded as reconciled. Beneficiaries with no birth certificate, death notices, or tax records. A Mr. Howard Lintry, listed as holding 11 policies, had apparently died 4 times in 2 years. But the most damning discovery came in the form of a single green ledger, stored in the bottom drawer of Winton's personal filing cabinet, marked only with the initials HJW. This was the real book. It listed actual investor names, dates of deposits, amounts, and Winton's shorthand notations for how the funds were being moved between shell accounts. One column was simply labeled Fluff. Under Fluff were monthly notes. Rent P.O. Box Concord, 3 identities. Typist bonus, keep quiet. Appease Grafton widow, made up, $15 via order slip. Strake ordered Winton's arrest that very night. Harold J. Winton's defense. Winton didn't flee. He didn't even seem surprised. He calmly handed over the keys to his office, made tea for the officers, and asked only that his wife not be disturbed. During his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty, but gave no denial when asked directly if the company's clients were real. "I offered peace of mind," he said. "Isn't that what insurance is?" He refused a lawyer, represented himself, filed motions in perfect handwriting, quoted scripture and actuarial textbooks. He called no witnesses. The trial lasted 12 days. The jury took 23 minutes to convict him. What about the money? Despite extensive investigation, most of the investor funds, estimated at nearly $47,000, were never recovered. Records showed that Winton had made a few modest purchases: land for a future school, a piano for the town hall, books for the library. He never drove a car, never traveled. Mildred Locke claimed he never even cashed his own salary checks, just filed them. Where the money went remains unclear. Some believe he burned it. Others think he buried it, though searches of his property turned up nothing but ledgers, typewriter ribbons, and meticulous records of imaginary people. The most disturbing detail: in a locked drawer of Winton's desk, investigators found a thick file titled "Retirement Accounts, Legacy Clients." It contained dozens of handwritten letters, supposedly from elderly policyholders, thanking him for his kindness, his honesty, and his patience. All had shaky cursive, misspellings, and very human phrasing. Every one was written in Winton's hand. He had created a network of imaginary lives, not just as cover but as companionship. Judge Strake, in his sentencing remarks, called it an empire of echoes. Winton was sentenced to 12 years in Concord State Prison. He served 9, kept to himself, and was released in 1924. He died 3 years later in a boarding house in Maine. No funeral, no obituary. He left behind one note: "They paid for something that didn't exist, but I gave them comfort. That's worth more than a payout." After the quiet conviction of Harold J. Winton in 1915, most people in Ordway, New Hampshire, wanted to forget the entire ordeal. His office was shuttered. The town council quietly removed his name from donor plaques. His spaniel, Muffet, was given to a nearby family. The church pew he once filled remained vacant for years. But forgetting proved harder than expected. Winton's files, confiscated, boxed, and shelved by state authorities, remained intact. And over the years, a trickle of researchers, graduate students, and fraud examiners found themselves drawn to the strange scope of his scam. The more they looked, the stranger it became. Mildred Locke's testimony. At the heart of this unfolding web was Mildred Locke, the typist who had worked alongside Winton for nearly 5 years. In 1920, she agreed to be interviewed as part of a civil claim brought by defrauded investors seeking to recover what remained of their funds. Her testimony, nearly 40 pages long, contained details that had never been raised in Winton's trial. "He didn't just invent clients," she said. "He built stories for them." She described how Winton would spend evenings walking the ledger, reading aloud entries about his imaginary clients as if recalling old friends. One in particular, a Mr. Barton Eli, had been granted a wife, 2 daughters, and a pension. Winton wrote Christmas letters from Barton to his daughters, none of whom existed. Locke also recalled one occasion when she found Winton weeping at his desk. When asked what was wrong, he replied, "I had to let her die. There was no other way." He was referring to a fictional widow named Gertie Gam, whose policy had matured. He decided to write her out of the books. False trails and real losses. A key problem in unwinding the Ordway Mutual scam was that many of Winton's investors had passed away by the time the truth came to light, or had never told their families they'd invested in the first place. The micro-investment scheme, $25 here, $50 there, was designed to feel too small to worry about. Many investors assumed the paperwork was legitimate and wrote it off as a loss when they stopped receiving dividends. Investigators eventually compiled a list of 263 verified victims, spread across 6 states. Total known losses, $47,190. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $1.4 million today. But despite subpoenas and financial tracing, most of the funds had simply disappeared. The barn account. One lead came from an old man named Louis Prager, a farmer who had done occasional handyman work at Winton's property. He remembered something odd. One day, Harold asked me to move a stone basin behind his barn, said he was planting a tulip patch, but it was November. Beneath the basin had been a small hatch likely leading to a root cellar. It was old, dry, and smelled of sawdust. After Winton's arrest, police searched the property thoroughly, but no stone basin was listed in the records. When investigators returned in 1922, the entire barn had been dismantled, the ground leveled. Nothing was found. But an aerial photo from 1916 showed a circular depression behind the barn, exactly where Prager said the hatch had been. Did Winton bury the money there, or was it moved before the trial? No one knows. Winton's prison years. Winton's time in Concord State Prison remains a source of fascination. Despite being labeled a white-collar fraudster, Winton quickly became a kind of inmate librarian, organizing materials, indexing old court transcripts, and even writing ethics guides for newer prisoners. Several guards reported that he kept imaginary client files even in prison. He wrote letters on their behalf, maintained journals about their fictional lives. When questioned, he calmly stated, "I owe them continuity." One guard, Ephraim Langley, recalled, "You'd think he was running an office from his cell, always working, but no one was ever on the receiving end of those letters." The ledger lives on. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Ordway scam lies in the Green Ledger, the one recovered from Winton's filing cabinet, his true journal of deception. It was detailed to an obsessive degree. Weekly earnings, real and imagined. Client birthdays. Tax estimates based on fictional jobs. Marriage dates, policy start dates, fictional illnesses and recoveries. Some entries read like a novel, others resembled accounting textbooks. One entry simply reads, "They believe because they want to believe. I simply offer structure." The ledger now sits in the archives of the New Hampshire Historical Society. Visitors may view it under supervision. Some have reported a strange feeling when handling the pages. As one researcher described, "It's like touching the life of a man who didn't know where fiction ended and the world began." The myth of Harold J. Winton. In the decades following his death, Winton became something of a folk figure among fraud investigators, a cautionary tale told in training seminars and university courses. But unlike flamboyant conmen of his era, Winton's story is muted. There were no yachts, no mistresses, no lavish purchases. He lived modestly, ate modestly, and invested his energy not into luxury but into the careful construction of fictional order. He didn't crave money as much as the illusion of accountability. In the end, Winton wasn't chasing wealth. He was building a universe where he was the only one who knew what was real. So who were his victims? The investors, surely. But also Mildred Locke, who lived the rest of her life quietly and refused to speak of Ordway Mutual again. And perhaps Winton himself, who spent years writing letters to people who would never write back. When Harold J. Winton died in 1927, there was no obituary. His burial was handled by the state. No next of kin came forward. No former clients or employees spoke at the graveside. The headstone was a simple, weathered plaque, HJW 1872-1927, nothing more. But even after his death, his ghost lingered not in a supernatural sense but in paper, in filings, in margins. in the creeping realization that, for nearly a decade, a man ran a completely fictitious financial institution in broad daylight and no one noticed. It was not a crime of brute force. There was no violence, no shouting, no chase. It was a slow, methodical hollowing out of the idea of trust. The missing years. Between Winton's release in 1924 and his death 3 years later, almost nothing is known. He relocated to a coastal boarding house in Bath, Maine, under his own name, and lived quietly. The landlady, Mrs. Helena Brower, later told a local reporter, "He was polite, always had a book, wore a suit every day, even in summer, told me he worked in special risk assessment, whatever that means." She remembered one particular habit. Winton would sit on the back porch each evening with a notepad, scribbling furiously, occasionally crossing things out with visible frustration. After his death, a locked wooden box was found beneath his bed. Inside were stacks of neatly folded papers, each bearing a fictional letterhead from companies that didn't exist. Brightshire Maritime Surety, Westminster Pet Assurance, Tranquil Grove Final Expense Planning. Some letters bore dates into the 1930s. Others were interoffice memos from Winton to himself. He was, it seemed, still running his imaginary empire on paper until the very end. The emotional toll. One of the more understated impacts of the Ordway Mutual scandal was the emotional harm it inflicted. For the 263 known victims, many of them were elderly or nearing retirement. Some had told their families they had smart investments. Others believed their premiums were going toward something secure. When the scam unraveled, shame overtook anger. A 1933 retrospective article in the New Hampshire Observer noted, "Not a single lawsuit was filed by a direct victim after 1920. Most accepted the loss in silence." A letter from a man named Denton White, who had invested $300 in 1911, was found among state archives. It reads, "It's not the money I miss. It's what I thought it meant, that I had made a grown man's decision, that I had something to leave behind." The regulatory aftershock. While Winton's scam wasn't massive in modern terms, its exposure sent quiet ripples through the regional insurance industry. In 1916, New Hampshire implemented new verification procedures for small insurers, requiring a minimum of 3 independent policyholders for licensing, external audits every 18 months, verification of client identities through municipal records. Winton had exposed a weakness not in financial modeling, but in assumptions. Regulators assumed no one would bother to fake an entire business from scratch. He proved them wrong. Academic interest and ethical debates. By the 1950s, Winton's case began appearing in university ethics courses, not as a case of criminal genius, but as a psychological study in pathological administration. Psychologists later speculated that Winton exhibited traits of what would now be called maladaptive fantasizing, a condition where individuals create detailed false realities and retreat into them with structured obsession. Dr. Rosalind Mercer, who published a paper on Winton in 1962, wrote, "He was not an embezzler in the conventional sense. He was an architect of worlds that felt more ordered than the one he inhabited. His crime was not driven by profit, but by a need to author reality." A box of names. In 1998, long after Winton's files were believed to be fully archived, a metal file box was discovered in the attic of the former Ordway Mutual building, by then a historical society office. Inside were 73 index cards. Each bore a name, a policy number, and a short personal description, but these were not real people. Each was entirely fictional, with invented jobs, birthdays, and family members. But the strangest detail. Each card had a hand-drawn portrait, small, rough sketches in pencil. These were the people Winton had created. One had glasses, another wore a bow tie. One woman had her hair in a bun, with Policy 843 survived influenza scrawled beneath. He didn't just invent clients. He gave them faces. Final reflection. Harold J. Winton was not a charming fraudster nor a flamboyant showman. His was a crime of bureaucracy, of forged ledgers, of polite deceit and tidy rows of imaginary lives. And that's what made it so dangerous. He never raised suspicion because he didn't seek to impress. He sought to maintain, to be invisible, to appear utterly ordinary. The scam didn't thrive because no one was watching. It thrived because everyone trusted the quiet man at the desk. And in many ways, it still echoes. Every time we sign a policy, every time we trust a number, every time we file away a statement and assume it's real. Harold J. Winton proved that fraud doesn't have to be flashy. Sometimes it just needs to look official. Story 4. The Typist Who Knew Too Much: Murder in the Midwest. In the winter of 1935, Helen Marie Darden walked to work in the pale morning light of Indianapolis. The streets were still wet from last night's flurries, slush collecting in the corners of brick buildings and gutters. She moved with purpose, not too fast, not too slow. Clutching a brown paper sack with her lunch and gloves, she made her way up the wide stone steps of the Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company and disappeared into a world of paper. Helen was a typist, one of over 24 administrative staff who filled out the cavernous 7th floor of the grain company's headquarters. Her job was not exciting, nor was it dull. It was steady carbon copies, invoice forms, memos typed with care. No one paid her much attention, and that's exactly why she noticed everything. 3 months later, Helen was found dead in her small boarding room. The police ruled it an accident. But the contents of her desk would tell a different story. The dead file. At first glance, Helen's life seemed as routine as her handwriting, precise, balanced, unassuming. She lived in a narrow brownstone run by a widow named Mrs. Edna Folk, took her coffee black and walked to work no matter the weather. She didn't date, didn't keep company, didn't take part in office chatter. But after her death, something unusual happened. A week after her burial, Mrs. Folk contacted the police. She had found a file folder hidden beneath a false bottom in Helen's suitcase. Inside were typed transcripts, conversations, memos, and financial entries, none of which made immediate sense. Some were fragments. Mr. Allerton, approved despite shipment, never leaving Buffalo. Do not refile memo 49, destroy after review. Guaranteed delivery backdated, transit logs must match, notify 3rd floor only. Along with the documents was a small, cloth-bound notebook filled with Helen's handwriting. 3 sets of books. Westfield Rail doesn't exist. Wilkins invoice number repeated twice, same shipment. Barrage mentioned again. Helen had uncovered something. And whatever it was, it had gotten her killed. The company on 7th and Market. The Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Co. had been in business since 1919. A merger of 3 shipping firms and 1 warehousing operation. It was one of the Midwest's largest grain exporters, providing wheat, corn, and barley to buyers across the country and abroad. The company's structure was deeply bureaucratic. Each floor had its purpose. 3rd floor, shipping approvals and contracts. 5th floor, accounting and payroll. 7th floor, correspondence and records. Helen worked in correspondence. Her job was to retype dictated memos, create duplicates of shipping manifests, and ensure carbon copies were filed under the correct triplicate ledger system. No one expected her to read what she typed. But she did. The suspicious shipment. A shipping manifest dated October 22, 1934, listed 18 rail cars filled with barley destined for Duluth, Minnesota. The invoice was signed by a J. Wilkins, and approved for payment the next day. But in Helen's notes she wrote, "Same invoice number appeared Sept 10, same weight, same car numbers. Rail yard records missing." She cross-referenced train schedules and realized something odd. The rail cars listed had already been assigned to a different shipment the day before. The barley never went to Duluth. The company had billed a non-existent shipment twice. The missing floor. During her daily routines, Helen also overheard names, particularly a man named Mr. Allerton on the third floor. She never met him, but he came up often. One day, Helen misdelivered a file and briefly stepped onto the third floor. What she found unsettled her. The floor was nearly empty, just 2 desks, 1 dim light, and stacks of unused filing cabinets. A man in a gray suit looked up and said only, "Wrong floor, miss." She never went back, but she did write this in her notebook. "There is no staff on third. Where are the 14 clerks listed in the directory?" And beside it she drew a symbol, a small triangle with a line through it, possibly something she saw on the manifest headers. Helen's last week. In March 1935, Helen stopped bringing her lunch to work. She was seen speaking quietly with a former co-worker, Maybelle Rusk, who had left the company in January. Maybelle would later tell investigators, "Helen said she had something to show me, said she was trying to figure out if she was crazy or if everyone else was just pretending. She said, 'I think they're laundering rail cars.' I didn't understand." That night Helen went home, as usual. Mrs. Folk said she heard nothing unusual, but in the morning Helen didn't come down for breakfast. She was found fully dressed, slumped over her writing desk, head resting on a stack of papers. The cause of death was listed as accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, a gas leak from the old wall heater. But the coroner's report noted something strange. The window was open. The room had been well ventilated. The company's response. The day after her death, the grain company sent a representative to collect her desk contents. Mrs. Folk refused entry. Police asked few questions, satisfied with the ruling. Helen was buried in an unadorned plot in Crown Hill Cemetery, without ceremony. But rumors swirled inside the office. Her coworkers, many of whom never spoke to her while alive, suddenly recalled strange comments, odd habits. One, Catherine Ray, remembered this. Helen always kept carbon duplicates. She said the originals were lies. A quiet cover-up. Over the next 6 months, at least 3 people left the company abruptly. 2 filed no forwarding address. 1, a junior accountant, was found dead in Illinois. No foul play suspected. No official charges were filed. But in 1936, the Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company quietly reorganized. Its accounting division was moved to Chicago. The third floor was converted to storage. And all records from 1933–1935 were reportedly destroyed in a flood. Helen Darden left behind no family, no estate, no diary, only a cloth notebook, a handful of carbon copies, and questions that still linger. Why did she keep the papers? Did she plan to go public? And if it wasn't an accident, who opened the window? By the spring of 1936, Helen Darden's name had mostly faded from office whispers at the Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company. The clerks on the 7th floor moved on. Her desk was reassigned. Her name scrubbed from the employee directory. But Maybelle Rusk didn't forget. After her unsettling conversation with Helen and hearing of her suspicious death just days later, Maybelle quietly began her own investigation, one made harder by the fact that no one wanted to talk. And when they did, it was always in hushed tones, behind drawn blinds. But through Helen's old notebook and her own memory of odd office procedures, Maybelle began pulling at threads no one else had dared to tug. The triangle mark. The curious symbol Helen had drawn in her notebook, a triangle with a line through it surfaced again. Maybelle remembered seeing it stamped on the bottom corner of certain invoice sheets marked internal only. These invoices were printed on heavier stock paper and rarely left the third floor. Curiously, these marked documents never listed a destination address, just vague shipping references like Grain Yard 6 or Private Consignment, Route 17. Maybelle later found a discarded copy in the trash near the elevators. It bore a similar triangle. She brought it to a friend who worked at the city's railway office. The railcar numbers on the sheet, all inactive, decommissioned years prior. But on the books, they were still moving. The laundering of movement. What Helen had begun to uncover, what Maybelle was now exposing, was a fraud scheme built not on disappearing money, but fabricated motion. The company appeared to be reporting the same set of rail cars transporting shipments over and over again, despite those cars being out of commission. They were inventing movement. Here, how it likely worked. An invoice was filed for a shipment of grain or corn. A railcar ID was attached, one that had previously existed but was no longer in service. No actual shipment occurred, but the invoice generated real income, often subsidized by government contracts or claimed insurance on lost product. Profits were quietly laundered, recorded as legitimate delivery losses or warehousing damages. Over time, these phony shipments added up, small enough to avoid suspicion individually, but collectively siphoning off tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent claims and subsidies. The third floor silence. Why didn't anyone blow the whistle? Because the third floor, the center of the falsified shipping records, was functionally closed to most staff. It was staffed by a rotation of 3 men, all known to be close with upper management. Mr. Allerton, S. Delaney, E. Portman. The internal directory listed a full complement of employees for the third floor, but Maybelle knew better. The names were fake. Helen had circled 4 of them in her notebook with the word ghosts. What made the deception effective was its subtlety. The shipping floor existed but barely functioned. The names were listed, but the people weren't real. The ledgers looked tidy because they were engineered to be. Helen had found the cracks, and someone, it seemed, had silenced her before she could widen them. A missing memo. In early April 1936, Maybelle visited the state archives posing as a graduate student. She requested copies of agricultural shipping logs from 1930–1935. One folder, labeled Eastern Rail Consortium Emergency Subsidy Records, contained a familiar name. Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit had received a $36,000 federal subsidy, following a supposed weather-related shipment loss in 1934, right in the window Helen had flagged in her notes. The documents were signed by Mr. J. Wilkins, the same name tied to Helen's fake invoice. Maybelle dug further. No J. Wilkins was ever licensed with the company, nor listed in tax records. He existed only on paper. A second death. In the summer of 1936, Seymour Delaney, one of the third-floor operatives, was found dead in a boarding house in Lafayette. Official cause: suicide by barbiturate overdose, but the coroner's report was vague. His employer was listed as independent consultant. No funeral was held. The following week, the company announced the dissolution of its third-floor operations and a renewed focus on transparency and modernization. No mention of Delaney's connection to the firm, no mention of Helen. The carbon collection. What remained of Helen's carbon copies, thankfully, had not been lost. Before her death, she had stashed a set of duplicates inside a hollow book titled Methods of Modern Filing, shelved in the public library 2 blocks from her office. Maybelle, following a hunch based on a passing comment Helen had once made, "The only book worth reading is one that no one ever checks out," retrieved the book. Inside, 12 carbon slips, duplicate invoices, typed memos with forged initials, one unsigned shipping authorization with 4 triangle stamps. Maybelle turned them over to the city's attorney's office, anonymously. Within 3 weeks, a quiet investigation was launched. The company's end. By 1938, Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company had been fully absorbed by a larger transportation conglomerate. No criminal charges were filed, no arrests. But its leadership quietly changed. The president, Raymond Wilkes, retired unexpectedly. A mass audit of records was ordered. Files from 1933 to 1936 were deemed incomplete and unreliable. The company's name vanished from federal subsidy logs after 1937. There was no scandal, no headlines, just a quiet unraveling. Maybelle's silence. Maybelle never came forward publicly. She moved to Chicago, married, and worked for a small printing company until her retirement in 1961. In her later years, she shared the full story with her niece, who recorded the account and submitted it to a local historical society. In that recording, Maybelle says, "Helen didn't die because she was nosy. She died because she saw something broken and tried to fix it. Alone, quietly, the way good people do." The final note. In Helen's notebook, on the very last page in slightly messier handwriting than the rest, was one sentence. "If I vanish, someone has to finish this, even if they just file it away." She was right, it was filed away. But not forgotten. By the 1940s, the Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company was no longer part of the regional business conversation. Its assets had been folded into a larger logistics firm, its records misplaced in administrative transitions, and its past staff scattered across the Midwest. Publicly, it was just another casualty of economic modernization. Privately, it was something else. A company that had nearly mastered the art of laundering movement of making stillness look like business. And Helen Darden, the quiet typist who noticed too much, was buried beneath that illusion. But not forever. Reopened in name only. In 1952, a mid-level accountant with the Department of Agriculture, Thomas Grier, reviewing old commodity subsidy records, flagged 3 1934 shipments listed under grain loss claims. The destination, Duluth, Minnesota. The railcar IDs were obsolete, and the shipping authorization bore a familiar triangle symbol. When Grier contacted the freight lines, they confirmed that the railcars had never moved during that time. The shipments were fictional. The subsidies had been real. He launched a formal inquiry and requested surviving documents from the now-defunct Indiana Consolidated Grain and Transit Company, but most records had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1945. The remaining ledgers were incomplete. Grier submitted a memorandum noting the high probability of historical subsidy fraud, with ties to a company's internal fabrication scheme. The memo was filed. No action was taken. What was lost and what was hidden? Several pieces of Helen's carbon copy evidence were lost during the company's sale, but the duplicates she had hidden in the hollowed-out library book resurfaced again in 1974, when a university librarian stumbled across them during a special collection review. The book had been checked out only once in the prior 4 decades by Maybelle Rusk, the week after Helen's death. The carbon copies were still crisp, faded but legible. They showed matching invoice numbers for conflicting shipment dates, approval initials that changed halfway through a document, payment entries with no corresponding recipient. One document contained a chilling error, a freight form with Helen's own initials forged at the bottom. It was dated 2 days after her death. Helen's legacy. In 1991, A small team of journalists with the Indiana Historical Fraud Review published a long-form piece titled The Carbon Witness: The Life and Death of Helen Darden. The article, built from decades of pieced-together documents, tapes, and testimony, finally gave her story a voice. They called her the unintended auditor, a woman who simply did her job too well. The story drew modest attention, sparking interest among true crime historians and accounting ethicists. One university even offered a guest lecture series on the ethics of whistleblowing in legacy institutions. In her honor, a scholarship was established at Indiana State University. The Helen Darden Award for Quiet Vigilance, granted to students studying forensic accounting and archival research. The triangle symbol, a lasting mystery. Despite years of investigation, the meaning of the triangle symbol with the line through it was never confirmed. Some believe it was an internal marker used to denote fake transactions. Others think it referred to a specific account or ledger series, an inside code used only among a handful of operatives. One rare copy of a printed ledger from 1933 lists a delta slash in its corner, next to a margin note that simply says, "Do not audit." Was it code? Was it a warning? Was it Helen who underlined it in red pencil? No one knows. Who killed Helen Darden? The official cause, accidental gas poisoning, was never revised. The open window was explained away as ventilation from earlier in the evening. The heater was tested and found faulty, though inconsistencies in the report were never reconciled. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no broken glass, but her landlady insisted the night was quiet, no smell of gas, no flickering pilot light. And of course, there was the document dated after her death. If it was a forgery, it suggests someone knew she had died and chose to sign her name anyway. Why? To continue the illusion of normalcy, to erase a loose end, or to throw doubt onto everything she had uncovered. The power of a typist. It's easy to forget how much power lies in the hands of those behind the typewriter. Helen Darden was not a detective. She had no badge, no legal authority. She had access only to information and the patience to read it. Her death, quiet and technically unexplained, was never followed by trials or headlines. But it left a mark. Because in the paper trail she left behind carbon copies tucked into books, scribbled notes in margins, triangle stamps, and interrupted invoices, she gave history something precious. A record of what should not have been. Final reflection. Not every crime story ends in courtroom drama. Sometimes, the justice comes quietly years later, in a library archive or a footnote in a university lecture. Helen's story is one of persistence without power, awareness without acclaim. And in the silence of office halls, beneath the hum of typewriters and the smell of carbon paper, she became a witness no one could erase. Story 5. The Safecracker's Apprentice, a 1911 train job gone silent. At 4:47 a.m. on a damp morning in April 1911, train number 803 departed from Spalding Station in rural Nebraska, heading east toward Omaha. It carried fewer than 24 passengers and just 3 sealed freight cars. One of them, car number 14B, was under special guard. Inside that car was a strongbox. It was bolted to the floor, steel reinforced, double lock clasp. Inside sat $78,000 in negotiable bonds and cash en route to the Western Trust Exchange for transfer. By 9:12 a.m., when the train pulled into Mill Creek Junction, the strongbox was gone. The locks were untouched. The car door was locked from the inside. The guards swore they hadn't seen or heard a thing. And that was the beginning of one of the quietest, strangest, and most skillful train thefts in American history carried out, authorities later believed, by a teenage apprentice known only as Copperhand Charlie. The setup. The Western Trust Exchange routinely moved cash and bonds by rail, trusting the discretion of isolated trains and the presumed security of their strongboxes. Most people knew these shipments existed, but few knew the routes. Fewer still knew the specific cars, which made what happened on April 7, 1911, all the more remarkable. The guards aboard Car 14B had both been vetted veterans, one a former Pinkerton, the other a retired Army quartermaster. They sat only 10 feet from the strongbox, separated by a steel partition. They drank coffee, played cards, logged their hours. And yet when the train arrived and the car was opened, the strongbox was missing. No signs of force, no fingerprints, no scratches, just a bolt hole in the floor where the container had been mounted. And beneath it, a small copper wire, curled, almost as if left on purpose. The apprentice appears. In the early weeks of the investigation, authorities looked at the usual suspects: known safecrackers, disgruntled ex-employees, and transient workers near the Spalding line. But all leads dried up, until one quiet letter arrived in the Omaha Division office of the Southern Rail Authority, addressed in block lettering. "You're looking for the apprentice, not the master. He learned too fast." No return address, no postmark. Inside the envelope, a small, clean square of leather, burnished, cut precisely, embossed in gold with the image of a lockpick and one word below it: Copper Hand. The name was unfamiliar, but soon, whispered stories began surfacing of a boy who learned safecracking by listening through floors, of hands so steady they could pick a safe by heartbeat, of a child trained by one of the best who outgrew his teacher. A teenager, a ghost, the master, Gentleman Reeve. The trail eventually led to Wallace Gentleman Reeve, a well-dressed career thief known for his habit of targeting small-town banks and train stations with minimum violence and maximum precision. Reeve had disappeared in 1909 after a botched heist in Wyoming. At the time, authorities believed he was dead. But Reeve had, in fact, gone underground literally. He was hiding out in a boarding house basement in Topeka, Kansas, where he taught safecracking techniques to a young apprentice, reportedly in exchange for the boy's help during heists. According to a later confession by an unrelated accomplice, Reeve called the boy Charlie, but his real name was never learned. He was described as around 16, 17 years old. Very quiet, rarely spoke above a whisper. Excellent memory, could recall lock tumbler sequences after one attempt. Left-handed. Wore copper wire, rings on his middle fingers when working. One story said Reeve had given the boy an ultimatum: steal one clean job on your own, no tools, then you're ready. Train number 803 may have been that test. The guard's account. One of the two guards aboard the train, Corporal Amos Delvin, gave a curious testimony during the internal inquiry. "Nothing felt wrong, but when I woke up from a brief nod, I remember a smell, not smoke, not oil, metal like warm pennies." That detail stood out to investigators. Safecrackers often used oil, graphite, or rubber grease, but copper, that was new. And one other thing. The car had a small ventilation duct on the floor near the strongbox. It had never been secured. It was used to cool the cargo. The duct led directly beneath the train, to a maintenance crawlspace. It had never been considered a point of vulnerability. The evidence beneath. A follow-up inspection of the maintenance tunnel beneath car 14B yielded new evidence. 3 small copper marks scored into the rail. Investigators believed these were used to align a tool, a pulley system, or hoist to lift the box down while the train was in motion. It would have required precise timing, incredible balance, detailed knowledge of the car's undercarriage. The working theory: someone had boarded the train before it left Spalding, possibly during overnight maintenance. They remained in the crawlspace beneath the car for hours. At a quiet stretch near mile marker 212, they disengaged the bolts, lowered the box, and either dropped off the moving train or passed the cargo to an accomplice waiting at a junction point. And then they vanished. A fence in Chicago. Weeks later, a pawnbroker in Chicago alerted authorities to a peculiar situation. A teenager had attempted to trade in a bond certificate issued by Western Trust, Exchange 1, matching the stolen batch. But the boy had said little, just placed the bond on the counter and left when questioned. The pawnbroker remembered only 2 details. He wore leather gloves, but his middle fingers were wrapped in copper wire. He carried no bag, no tools, no wallet. A composite sketch was made, distributed across state lines, but no name, no prints, no further sightings emerged. The legend grew. A phantom reputation. In the years that followed, more Copperhand stories emerged. In Kansas City, a lockbox was emptied at a depot, no signs of tampering. A copper ring was found on the floor. In St. Louis, a failed attempt to crack a postal vault left behind a copper triangle etched into the doorframe. In Denver, a train guard reported seeing a shadow drop from beneath the car before a scheduled stop. No one was found. Each time the details were similar: silent entry, surgical precision, minimal evidence. And then nothing. The last note. In 1920, nearly a decade after the train job, a retired Pinkerton detective received a plain envelope. Inside was a strip of copper, twisted into the shape of a question mark. The return address was a train depot in Spalding, Nebraska, long closed, set for demolition. On the back of the strip, etched with a needlepoint file, were the words, "Apprentice no more." He had graduated. But who was Copperhand Charlie? And how could someone so precise, so real, vanish without a trace? For investigators assigned to the theft of train number 803 Strongbox, it became increasingly clear that the crime was unlike any other on record. There was no forced entry, no sabotage, no threats, just absence. A box worth nearly $80,000 vanished from a locked train car with 2 armed guards on board during active transit. And at the center of the mystery was a name with no first name, no birth certificate, no criminal record: Copperhand. Who was he? And more chillingly, where would he strike next? Revisiting the scene. In the summer of 1911, Pinkerton agent Simon Rybeck, a veteran of freight crime investigations, traveled to Spalding, Nebraska. Rybeck had seen plenty of train thefts, coal diversions, livestock swaps, even staged robberies involving full crews. But this was different. This, he wrote in a personal memo, was art. He interviewed maintenance staff, train yard porters, and fuel hands. Eventually, he spoke with Marlon Peake, an apprentice machinist who claimed to have seen someone suspicious the night before the train's departure. Kid, maybe 17, real quiet, asked a lot of questions about undercarriage clearance, said he was new shadowing his brother, but he didn't have no badge. When shown a series of sketches, Peake pointed at the same composite drawn in Chicago, the boy who had pawned the bond. "Yeah, that's him, hands like a watchmaker." Rybeck had a location, a timeline, but the boy was already gone. A master's shadow. There's strong evidence that Gentleman Reeve, Charlie's reported mentor, had orchestrated the heist as a kind of final test, giving the boy all the theoretical knowledge, but forcing him to design and execute the job himself. Why? Because Reeve, nearing 50 at the time, had likely lost his edge. He was in hiding, under surveillance, and rumored to have suffered nerve damage in his left hand from a vault door accident in Kansas City. He needed someone to carry the torch. But Reeve was never arrested for the train job. In fact, he vanished from record in 1912. Rumors claimed he died in Mexico. Others suggested he was murdered by a competing crew. but still others believed he had changed identities and retired. What is known, however, is this. No major train heist between 1913 and 1920 bore Reeves' signature methods. Instead, a new signature emerged. The copper markings. Between 1911 and 1919, a dozen unsolved heists across the Midwest shared at least one of the following elements. Copper residue near lock mechanisms. No physical damage to safes or vaults. Removed security bolts placed back in order. Scraps of copper wire left behind coiled or twisted into shapes. In 1915, a payroll vault in Missouri was found empty. The only trace was a twisted copper ring inside the safe. It had been placed upright, balanced on the ledge. In 1917, a boxcar in Kansas City was robbed of bearer bonds mid-journey. The undercarriage latch was found relocked with a copper shim still inside the mechanism. In 1919, the U.S. Treasury's regional shipping hub in Cincinnati suffered a break-in during a thunderstorm. Nothing but the locked strongroom had been touched, and inside, all high-value certificates were missing. A cleaning clerk found a handkerchief on the floor with 2 copper fingerprints smudged into the fabric. The thief had never been seen, but the nickname had stuck, Copperhand. Patterns in absence. What made these thefts so unique was not just the lack of physical evidence, it was the psychological profile they painted. This wasn't greed, it was discipline. Whoever Copperhand was, he never struck the same region twice in a year. Only targeted sealed shipments containing negotiable instruments. Avoided cash-heavy robberies and anything that risked collateral damage. Never hurt anyone. Never involved outside crews. In fact, experts began to wonder if he operated entirely alone. There were no signs of split takeovers, no informants, no leaks. As one federal investigator phrased it, he wasn't just a thief. He was a ghost in lockstep with industry hiding in the places we never thought to guard. The apprenticeship theory grows. In late 1916, a criminal informant named Thomas Keel, serving time in Illinois, told a warden something peculiar during an interview. They say Reeve had more than one student. Kid in Colorado, girl in St. Paul, he was building a school. Keel was dismissed as delusional. He also claimed to know where D.B. Cooper's grandfather lived. But when cross-referenced with unexplained vault thefts between 1912 and 1915, certain patterns emerged. Some speculated that Copperhand Charlie had not vanished but had changed methods, perhaps changed names, or worse, started teaching others. A kind of underground academy, invisible except for its signature technique, surgical theft through silence. The vanishing point, 1921. In March 1921, what would be the last attributed Copperhand job took place in Colfax, Iowa, where a steel vault door was opened cleanly overnight, with zero signs of tampering. Inside, only one item had been removed: a briefcase containing railroad dividend bonds totaling $32,000. There was no damage. There were no prints. But a clerk who arrived first reported something odd. There was a coin balanced upright on the safe's edge, a copper penny, shined up like new. It was the last verified Copperhand calling card. After that, the trail went dark. Speculation and legacy. What happened to Copperhand Charlie? There are 5 prevailing theories. He died, a train job gone wrong, a silent burial somewhere forgotten. He retired, possibly with enough wealth to disappear. Some believe he lived in obscurity under a different name. He was caught and silenced. No public record, but perhaps handled privately by railroad enforcers. He became someone else, a banker, a codebreaker, a government contractor. He was never real, a composite myth of multiple unsolved thefts, glued together by fear and folklore. But most experts disagree with the last one. Too many consistencies, too much precision, too many copper rings. Final clue, the apprentice's letter. In 1943, during the closure of an old private mail center in Kansas City, workers discovered a locked cubby. Inside was a single envelope, never mailed. Addressed to S. Rybeck, Pinkerton Office, Chicago. The letter inside was unsigned. It read, "I learned from the best. Then I became better. He told me the world is just a series of mechanisms, locks waiting to be known. I didn't break things, I opened them. I am not a criminal, I am a student of silence. No one ever heard me, not once, that was the point." At the bottom, a smear of copper powder sealed the page. Story 6. Letters from Cell Block D, the prison pimple swindle ring. In 1937, a woman named Viola Hembry of Duluth, Minnesota, received a letter postmarked from Weston State Penitentiary in West Virginia. The letter was thoughtful, polite, heartfelt. Its author, a man named Edward Eddie Malik, claimed he had been imprisoned for car theft but was no danger to anyone except myself. He had read Viola's name in a church registry newsletter for penpals to the incarcerated. He hoped for nothing more than kind conversation. Viola, a widow with no children, wrote back. She was not alone. Over the next 6 months, at least 214 women across 11 states would receive handwritten letters from inmates at Weston, all similar in tone, and all signed by different names but with unmistakably similar phrasing, penmanship, and emotional cadence. By the time prison officials took notice, $24,000 in cash, stamps, and personal gifts had been sent to Weston's cell block D, none of it declared, most of it smuggled. It was the beginning of one of the most intricate and undetected emotional confidence schemes ever uncovered behind bars. And at the center was one man, Edward Malik, inmate, autodidact, and the man whose handwriting could break hearts. The letters. The scheme worked because the letters felt real. They weren't generic or mass-produced. Each one responded directly to the prior message. They referenced details, adapted tone, even adjusted grammar based on the recipient's education level. Malik and, as it would later be discovered, a small team of collaborators, had built personal profiles for dozens of women using church newsletters, charity mailing lists, and classified ads looking for companionship. Each letter struck a balance between vulnerability and strength. A common excerpt. "Prison is made of stone, but the loneliness is heavier than the walls. Your words let in a little light. I want to be a better man not because of parole, but because of hope." He signed them with names like James L., Timothy N., Robert with 1B, or simply your friend always. Some women received sketches of birds, others poems. A few received locks of hair believed to be from guards or fellow inmates. And nearly all recipients were eventually asked for one of 3 things. A money order for new shoes. Stamps so I can keep writing you without burden. A photograph so I can remember what kindness looks like. How it stayed hidden. Weston State Penitentiary was overcrowded and underfunded. The mailroom processed hundreds of letters weekly with minimal staff. Few were ever opened unless flagged. Malik had struck an arrangement with 2 guards and a prison nurse. They helped him bypass scrutiny in exchange for a cut, usually in the form of booklets of stamps or outside credit managed by his brother in Pittsburgh. He ran the operation out of cell D47, a single-bed cell tucked near the end of the block. With him were Nathaniel Nate Durrell, a former typesetter with a photographic memory; William Lank Grissom, a forger who specialized in mimicking handwriting; Curtis Hall, the artist who drew bird sketches and likenesses of the women based on Malik's descriptions. Together, they became known within the cell block as the writer's table. Each night under low light they wrote, The victims. The scheme disproportionately targeted widows, unmarried women over 40, and women listed as active in church charities. Among the known victims, Mrs. Clara Van Holt, 62, who sent $380 in money orders over 3 years to an inmate named Martin. Helen Ruggers, a schoolteacher from Kansas, who mailed 47 personal letters and several photographs before authorities intervened. Lillian Ponsby, who moved to West Virginia in hopes of visiting her pen pal Robert, and was turned away at the gate. The name didn't exist. When the scam came to light in 1940, most victims refused to speak publicly. Some were too embarrassed. Others genuinely believed their correspondence had been real until the end. One victim, however, spoke anonymously to a local reporter. "He made me feel seen, heard, like I mattered to someone again. That's not something you can fake easily. And if it was all lies, then he was better at loving than anyone I ever knew." Unraveling the ring. The beginning of the end came not from law enforcement, but from jealousy. A younger inmate in cell block D, denied a spot at the writer's table, reported the operation to a new warden who had recently arrived from Pennsylvania. A sting was orchestrated. Letters were intercepted, responses rerouted, and several incoming packages were traced. On October 3, 1940, Warden Elijah Brent ordered a full search of cell D47. Inside, officials found 32 active pen pal files, complete with photographs and correspondence logs, over 200 pre-written letters waiting for signature and postage, a small printing press used to emboss return addresses on envelopes, a hidden drawer under the bed containing $470 in undeclared stamps. Malik, Hall, Durrell, and Grissom were separated and placed in solitary confinement. The prison nurse and 2 guards were quietly dismissed. No external charges were filed. Why not charge them? That remains a question debated by prison historians. Some believe Warden Brent feared a public scandal, especially one that would portray the penitentiary as a hub of emotional extortion. Others suggest the victims refused to cooperate with prosecution, making legal action impossible. In the end, the punishment remained internal. Malik lost his visitation rights and was barred from the mailroom. Grissom was transferred to another facility. Hall was denied parole. Durrell eventually died of pneumonia behind bars. And yet, even in solitary, Malik found a way to keep writing. Guards later reported finding hidden messages tucked into the seams of laundry bags, written on soap wrappers, and even inscribed with needles into strips of linen. He was obsessed not with money, but with being heard. An unresolved line. One final letter recovered in 1942 appeared to be a draft, never sent. It was written in a looser hand than usual, fewer flourishes. It reads, "To whoever reads this, I am not sorry for wanting to be known. I used names that weren't mine, but the words were always true. I only lied about the paper, not the heart. They say the worst thing about prison is silence, but it's not, it's being forgotten." The letter ends with a sentence that trails off midline. "If you were ever lonely and someone answered back, even if it was a stranger." There's no punctuation, no signature, just empty space. By the early 1940s, the emotional aftermath of Edward Malik's pen pal ring rippled well beyond the prison walls of Weston State. The ring had been quietly dismantled, its ringleader silenced in solitary confinement, and the media largely discouraged from publicizing the affair. But something peculiar happened next. The letters didn't stop. Across several states, women reported receiving new letters, different names, different handwriting styles, but familiar in tone, familiar in phrasing, familiar in heartbreak. It appeared that even as cell D47 fell silent, its voice continued elsewhere. Malik's method had spread, but how? And more importantly, to whom? The cult of the wordsmith. In late 1941, a new inmate named Charles Skip Vernon arrived at Weston. Vernon, a convicted check forger from Ohio, had a reputation for charisma and short cons. Within weeks, he began forming a small group of literate inmates who met each evening to talk poetry and practice penmanship. The group was officially benign encouraged, even by the prison's warden, as a positive social activity. But behind closed doors, it was something else. An informant later described the group as a letter-writing circle with purpose. They shared sample letters from Cell D47's archives, some smuggled in from sympathetic guards, others memorized by former collaborators. They practiced copying Malik's cadence, his vulnerable metaphors, his structured build-up to emotional requests. Each member adopted a persona, a fake name, backstory, and tone. They weren't just conning for money. They were rebuilding Malik's lost empire. Blueprints of a heart. What made Malik's letters so effective and why imitators failed was his understanding of emotional rhythm. This wasn't random flattery or pity-driven begging. It was structured like a story. Prison officials eventually recovered fragments of what appeared to be an instructional manuscript written by Malik in solitary confinement. Titled only "On the Line," it included insights such as: write her world before writing your own. Begin with empathy. Describe her environment to show attentiveness. Do not rush sorrow. Let pain emerge over time. Sincerity is best tasted slowly. Reveal need, but only after respect. The first 3 letters must not ask for anything. In one margin, he scribbled, "The real trick isn't in making her believe you're honest. It's in being the honest version of the lie." Malik wasn't teaching deception. He was teaching emotional mimicry, how to reflect someone's loneliness back at them in a form they'd welcome. The fatting line between truth and grift. The more investigators studied the ring, the more they were disturbed by a strange possibility. Were some of these letters no longer scams? Several imitators reportedly continued correspondence even after being released from prison. Some met their pen pals in person. One marriage certificate surfaced in 1945 between a woman in Indiana and a former Weston inmate whose prison alias was Henry T. In that case, the woman Judith Cole claimed she had known from the start that Henry wasn't who he said he was. She didn't care. "He was the first person to ask me how I slept, how I was feeling that morning, how my Sunday went. I didn't want honesty, I wanted kindness." The prison swindle had, somehow, become something more complex, a space where manipulation and sincerity were separated only by inches. The guard's confession. In 1952, a former Weston guard named Arthur "Slim" Barracks published a handwritten memoir titled "Behind the Bars, Beyond the Lies." Though never widely distributed, a section of the memoir detailed his involvement with Malik's ring. He claimed he had been the one to smuggle out many of the unsent letters after Malik was silenced, and had passed them on to other inmates in other institutions. "I couldn't bear to see his words go to waste. They weren't just tricks, they were balm for those guys and for the women. You call it fraud, I call it survival." He admitted to personally writing at least 17 letters under aliases to women in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. In the margins of the memoir, scrawled in a different hand, perhaps Malik, was a sentence: "If a lie gives someone the strength to wake up in the morning, is it still a crime?" A second generation emerges. By the late 1950s, law enforcement began encountering a new term in penpal-related scams: ghost correspondence. These were inmates who wrote heartfelt letters but didn't exist in any prison rolls. Names, ID numbers, and background stories were fabricated using old Weston templates. Letters were sometimes mailed from fake prison addresses or routed through associates. Investigators eventually realized these ghosts weren't all from Weston, they had originated elsewhere. The formula, however, was unmistakably Malik. Even decades later, versions of his technique popped up in unexpected places. In 1973, the FBI investigated a romance bond scam, originating in Florida letters from supposed political prisoners, asking for cash to escape injustice. In 1986, a Michigan woman was duped by a man claiming to be a wrongfully imprisoned Navy veteran, whose letters mimicked exact phrasing from known Malik correspondence. The structure never changed. Earn trust. Mirror the recipient. Make them feel central. Then slowly ask, but never demand. An ongoing echo. Malik died in prison in 1967. He was never paroled. He never gave a public interview. His records list cause of death as respiratory complications. His burial was unceremonious. No visitors, no relatives. But for years afterward, small envelopes still arrived at Weston, addressed to Edward Malik, cell D47. Some had money orders. Some had pressed flowers. One had a note. You helped me through my divorce. You never knew, but I did. Thank you. The final envelope. In 1992, a librarian in Ohio cataloging donated books discovered an envelope tucked into the back of a collection of prison poetry. Inside was a copy of one of Malik's early letters. At the bottom, written in fading ink. People want to believe they matter, not just once, but every time they open a letter. No name, no address. Only a copper paperclip. By the early 2000s, Edward Malik had faded into little more than a footnote in corrections history. Most official records listed him as a petty swindler. His death marked the end of a quiet, forgotten chapter in the long ledger of American prison life. But for those who study fraud, psychology, and the manipulation of intimacy, Malik's legacy was far from closed. His letter-writing scheme had grown into something larger than theft. It had become a mirror one held up to the people who responded, who gave, who believed. And perhaps, in some strange way, it was that mirror that made his crimes so quietly devastating. The therapist's perspective. In 2006, Dr. Leona Garris, a clinical psychologist at the University of Michigan, began studying archived penpal scams as part of a research project on emotional transference and fraud. Her team focused on emotional needs rather than criminal intent, not only of the scammers, but also of the victims. They found that over 70% of the women who replied to inmate correspondence lived alone or were recently widowed. Most recipients did not consider themselves duped even after the scam was exposed. Many had saved the letters in boxes, some wrapped in ribbons, long after they knew the sender was fictional. One quote from a subject stood out. He didn't lie about what mattered. The world was hard, he was kind. Garris concluded that Malik's ring operated on a different psychological plane than most frauds. It wasn't just about extraction. It was about creation of a relationship, a narrative, a space where two lonely people agreed to suspend disbelief. Was it a crime of the heart? That question has haunted criminologists. Malik and his team undoubtedly deceived their victims. They fabricated identities. They manipulated feelings. They benefited materially, at least in stamps and modest gifts. But no one was physically harmed. And in the case of multiple women, their letters were treasured. One woman, Dorothy Granger of Kentucky, kept every letter she received from James. After her death in 1983, her niece discovered the collection. She read through them and said, "I don't care if it was real. He got her through the worst years of her life. That's not a scam, that's grace." Still, legal scholars affirm that the law is not based on sentiment, it is based on intent and deception. By that standard, Malik's scheme was, and remains criminal fraud. But morally, the line remains blurred. Digital echoes. In the 2010s, prison pimple scams evolved into their digital descendants. Email cons, catfishing, and online romances built on fiction. But if you trace the structure of the most enduring emotional scams, you find the blueprint leads back to Malik. The empathy-laden introduction. The gradual opening of emotional wounds. The mutual sharing of sorrow and small joys. The slow, inevitable request. The promise of return someday, soon, when I'm out. These are not new ideas. They are Edward Malik's letters, rewritten for a new era. In a TEDx talk in 2017, Dr. Garris ended her speech with a quote. "It's easy to spot a liar. It's much harder to admit that sometimes we'd rather be lied to than left alone." Malik's final testament. Shortly before his death, Malik managed to pass a small note to a chaplain at Weston. It was written in tiny cursive, folded into a scrap of Bible paper. The note read, "I do not repent my words, only the way I used them. I was the echo that answered lonely people, and maybe that was my punishment too, to know them and never be known." He signed it simply, Edward, the voice in the walls. A legacy in ink. In 2015, the Library of American Letters and Communication acquired a private archive of 1930s correspondence. Among them were dozens of Malik's original letters, some never mailed, others marked with annotations in pencil, tone notes, name changes, edits. Researchers now study the letters not just as artifacts of crime, but as literature. The handwriting is elegant. The prose is controlled. The metaphors, birds in cages, windows with no locks, the smell of rain through stone walls, are repeated with slight variation, crafted to each recipient. One letter, addressed to an unknown woman in Illinois, ends with a question. "If a man calls to you from behind bars and tells you the truth about his longing, his regret, his wish for redemption, but lies about his name, did he still speak honestly?" The silence between the lines. Malik died forgotten by the world that punished him, but his words lived on, passed from woman to woman, from scammer to imitator, from jail cell to love letter archive. He remains a contradiction. A liar who told the truth. A fraud who gave comfort. A prisoner who became, in some small way, a voice for the voiceless. His legacy is not clean. It is not moral. It is not even wholly criminal. It is, like the best letters, deeply human.